So hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining the Association for Psychological Science for PSPI Live, a special virtual event series featuring articles published in APS's journal, Psychological Science in the Public Interest, or PSPI as we often call it. I'm Amy Drew. I'm the Director of Publications at APS. And if you don't know APS, we are an international organization of 25,000 psychological scientists and students of research psychology who are dedicated to advancing the field for the benefit of science and society. I'll also give a quick plug for the APS annual convention, which is back live and in person this year in Chicago from May 26th through 29th. And it will feature invited and submitted content from all areas of psychological science. You can find more information on the annual convention and all of APS's other exciting activities by visiting our website at psychologicalscience.org. So now on to the main event. You all are in for a special treat with this first PSPI Live. In today's program, you'll hear a review of the recent PSPI publication, Test an Eyewitness's Memory Only Once, from article author and APS fellow, Dr. John Wixted. Following that, we are honored to be joined by U.S. District Judge Jed Rakoff from the Southern District of New York, whom I will introduce a little later in the program. Before I turn it over to John to speak about his recent article, we'd like to play a special message from PSPI editor Nora Newcomb.
Welcome. I want to begin by introducing myself. I'm Nora Newcomb, professor of psychology at Temple University in Philadelphia. But more importantly, I'm the editor of the Psychological Science in the Public Interest monographs, which are published by the Association for Psychological Science. And we are today initiating the first of what we hope is a series called PSPI Live, in which we highlight some of our reports and get some commentary on them and discuss them a little more thoroughly. I'm very excited both about the series in general, but also about today, because we are highlighting a very timely report that's really an addendum to a previous report on eyewitness identification, authored by John Wixted, who's here today, and also by Gary Wells. This was an addendum that really dealt with a very important specific issue, which is that you can test eyewitness identification validly only once before you contaminate memory. And this has really important implications for literally life and death issues in adjudication. So today we're going to have not only, as I said, Dr. John Wixted, but also for commentary and perspective, Judge Jed Rakoff, who's a U.S. District Judge in the Southern District of New York State, and who, more relevantly for today, was the co-chair of a National Academy panel on eyewitness identification. So with that said, let's go forward.
All right, thanks to Nora for that message. Now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. John Wixted, an APS fellow and distinguished professor at the University of California, San Diego in the Department of Psychology. He's an expert in the area of eyewitness memory and also in episodic memory, forgetting, signal detection theory and models of recognition memory, and brain mechanisms of memory. In addition to his APS fellow status, he is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Society of Experimental Psychologists, where he has been recognized with the Howard Crosby Warren Medal. Dr. Wixted's work has been funded by the National Institutes of Mental Health, the National Science Foundation, and the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few logistical details. So this webinar will be 60 minutes in length. Attendees' cameras and mics will be off for the duration of the session, but we do encourage you to make use of that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions, which we'll pose to the panelists towards the end of today's session. This webinar will be recorded and video will be made available following the program, so you will be able to watch it again. And with that, I just want to say thank you again for joining us. And John, I will pass it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Amy. share my screen. There we go. All right, I hope you can see that. This is the title page of the paper recently published in PSPI. It's actually an amplification and elaboration of a recommendation, one of the recommendations in a white paper recently published by Wells et al. In Law and Human Behavior. They list 9 recommendations for eyewitness identification. Some of them are reiterations of past recommendations, and some of them are new. And one of the new ones seemed particularly important. So we wrote a whole paper about it. And that paper is test a witness's memory for a suspect only once. Okay. I'm going to have you be an eyewitness for a second here. Let's imagine you're looking out your window at your neighbor's house across the street, and you see a man climbing through a window, which looks suspicious. And he looks around to see if anybody's watching him, and you get a look at his face, a brief look, and this is him. He's climbing through the window. Take a good look at him. All right, you later find out that a murder was committed in that house. And so you tell the police you saw the guy who was climbing through the window, and they say, can you describe him? And so you give the police a description. And at some point later, maybe the next day, maybe a week later, they come up with a suspect who fits that description, who they think might have committed the crime, but they're not sure about that. They're going to show you his face to see if you confirm that was the guy. And they're going to put his face in a photo lineup, surrounded by 5 other fillers who are similar looking, but aren't suspected of committing the crime. And they want to see if you pick the suspect. And if you do, it will increase their confidence that they have the right guy. So I'm going to do that to you. You just witnessed a crime. And now let me show you a photo lineup to see if you can pick out the guy. Now, the police will tell you, and I will tell you, the perpetrator who you saw commit the crime may or may not be in this photo lineup. But if he is, pick him and tell me which one. So here we go. Take your time. And if we were live, I would ask you one at a time to raise your hand. Do you think it was this guy on the left? How about this guy in the top middle? What about this guy in the top right? And maybe a few hands would go up bottom left. This guy. What about this guy? What about none of the above? And I think, when I've done this live before, hands go up. Most hands go up when I say none of the above. And for the people who identified someone, I ask, how many of you were immediately certain that that's the guy you saw commit the crime? And nobody's hand goes up, usually. And I'm assuming that's true of all of you who are watching this right now. None of you were immediately certain that the guy you saw commit the crime is in this lineup, but that means you were good eyewitnesses because he is not in this lineup. The suspect in this lineup happens to be innocent, the guy I will designate as the suspect, and you didn't conclusively misidentify him. You were good eyewitnesses, but people think eyewitness identification is unreliable, and they think so because of the relationship between eyewitness identification and wrongful convictions. At least in large part, that's why they think so. Since the early 1990s, the Innocence Project has used DNA testing to overturn 375 wrongful convictions of the innocent. Many of these people spent decades in prison before finally being exonerated. The DNA test wasn't done until they were in prison for, say, 20 years. And actually, it turns out you're not the rapist. And this raises the question, what went wrong? How did these innocent people end up in prison? And the Innocence Project has an analysis of the first 325 DNA exoneration cases, looking back and trying to figure out, how did this happen? What went wrong? And they've identified a variety of contributing causes listed down here. But the leading cause, by far actually, was eyewitness misidentification, where in almost every case, the witness got on the witness stand and without any hesitation said, I'm 100% sure that guy over there did it. Nobody thinks these witnesses were lying. The implication is that eyewitness memory is just unreliable. But I want to point out that I just glossed over an incredibly important distinction between the first test of memory conducted early in a police investigation and any later test, such as the one that occurs maybe a year later at trial. And the problem is that testing a witness's memory of the suspect way back here early in the investigation contaminates the witness's memory for that suspect. Let's say that's the suspect. If he's innocent, it's the first time this witness is laying eyes on that face. And what's happening is that face is getting into the brain of the eyewitness, and you can't stop it from happening, and you can't take it out. And that's the problem. That's the basic problem. And our whole paper is an excruciatingly detailed overview of the empirical evidence and theoretical understanding of how memory works in support of that idea. But in the few minutes I have with you today, I don't have time to cover all of that. So instead, what I'm going to do is just prove it to you by asking you a simple question. Do you recognize this face? If we were live, I think I would see an ocean of hands going up. Yeah, you do. He was in the lineup that I just showed you. And I didn't ask you to form a memory of anybody's face in that lineup. I just asked you to make a recognition memory decision. And most of you probably decided that none of these guys are it. However, I put this face in your brain. So let's think about this in a little more detail about contaminated forensic memory evidence. Let's think about it step by step. So step one, a crime is committed, and at some point, a suspect will be detained, maybe right away, maybe later. And let's say this innocent suspect that I put in the lineup is the guy that they think was crawling through the window and later committed the murder. And they think it's him because he was seen arguing with the murder victim maybe earlier that day. So it's reasonable to think he might be the murderer. Okay. When the police arrive, they cordon up the crime scene and they conduct a forensic investigation. Now, why do they do that? Why don't they just take down a few notes and say supper's waiting at home and I got to get to it? We'll be back a week from Tuesday to conduct the forensic investigation. No, they don't do that. They cordon up the crime scene immediately because they want to minimize the chances of any contamination. And it's unarguably the case that you do that by conducting the investigation as soon as possible after the crime is committed. It's possible that there's some contamination happened before that, before the police got there, but you minimize the chance of that happening by conducting the investigation right away. And so they collect the evidence from the crime scene and maybe fingerprint evidence or whatever, and they knock on a few doors and they knock on your door and you say, I saw the guy climbing through that window. And so they're going to show you, put this guy's face in a lineup to see if you identify him. And they're going to ask you, does that face in your brain match this face right here? It's similar to what you asked the fingerprint examiner. Do these fingerprints from the crime scene, do the features of these fingerprints match the features of the suspect's fingerprints? But here we're asking about face prints, so to speak. Do these facial features match? So as you did, you compare that face and the other faces in the lineup to the representation in your brain. And if you picked him, some of you may have, you probably did so. It was an inconclusive identification. It might be him, I'm not sure. My confidence is low. But what typically happens, even when it's an inconclusive identification, is they just forget about that detail and the police notes say, witness positively identified the suspect, because you did land on the suspect and that's what they care about. And those words don't really convey what actually happened. The prosecutor sees those words and says, all right, we're gonna take this guy to trial. He was arguing with the murder victim in the hours before he was killed, and we have a positive identification from an eyewitness. We're going to put that witness on the stand at trial and have him identify this guy again. And problem with that, as I just showed you, is that testing memory for this guy puts that memory in the brain of the eyewitness, and you can't stop it. Moreover, it's happening at a time when the witness is thinking about the crime. That's the context that's activated in their brain. It's not like there's some other context activated, like they're not thinking about their wedding day or that last trip to Paris or 10,000 other contexts that could be activated in their brain. They're thinking about the crime. So not only are they creating a memory of this innocent suspect unintentionally, they're associating it with the crime. Now, if the police and prosecutors keep their focus on this guy, they don't know this guy's innocent. They're going to keep their focus on him because they got that positive identification. His face is going to continually be refreshed over that year. But this face of the perpetrator, which you saw briefly for a moment by the time of trial more than a year ago, you're never going to see that guy again. He's gone. Nobody knows who he is. And that memory is going to fade away because forgetting happens. This guy's face isn't going to fade away. I mean, the police might say, yeah, we thought it was that guy. He was heard arguing with the murder victim, and you're just confirming it was him, increasing the witness's confidence. They might do a live lineup because maybe it would be more impressive to jurors to know that they picked him out of a live lineup. So that's a second test. You might see his photo on the news or in social media. the police suspect this guy of having committed the murder. The witness might see his face at pretrial hearings, one thing after another during this year. It's going to keep refreshing this face. And by the time of trial, this witness is going to be absolutely sure he's the one who committed the crime, because that's who comes to mind when the witness thinks about the crime that was observed. And that's the problem. Assuming a recognizable photo of the suspect, it has to be a recognizable photo of the suspect. It isn't always, but if it is, and a good faith attempt to make an identification, witnesses don't always make a good faith attempt, but most of the time they do, making those two assumptions. The first test unintentionally, but unavoidably and irretrievably changes the witness's memory for the suspect. You can't stop it from happening. I did it to you. This is why no later test can provide better information than the first. No exceptions. I'm going to get back to this no exceptions clause in a minute. But most lineup outcomes do not convincingly implicate the suspect. Most of them are probably what happened to you when I showed you that photo lineup, a hesitant ID of the suspect, maybe some of you did, or a hesitant filler ID probably, or most of you probably a lineup rejection. In fact, I was involved in a recent police department field study of 350 eyewitness identifications, real eyewitness identifications, and 84% ended up in one of these. And what does that mean? Well, the words I'm about to put on the screen here is the most important message I can convey today. And here it is. These outcomes mean one thing and one thing only. The suspect does not match the witness's memory of the perpetrator. Hence, the suspect's face does not seem especially familiar. That's what these outcomes mean. They don't mean anything else. And as I've seen how say prosecutors and other people in the legal system react to our paper in PSPI, I believe I've come to understand something I didn't fully understand before. They don't think this way. They have a different theory of memory. So I want to elaborate on this issue a little bit by taking a different angle that we didn't cover in the paper, just for a couple slides here, an angle from neuroscience, because it leads to the exact same point, but also helps to clarify why this is what it means. There's a no match, no strong match. Okay, so here's your brain. I've turned it upside down. This is the back of your brain down here. These colored regions are the face processing regions of your brain. When you see a face, these regions become active. If you have damage to these regions of the brain, faces don't make any sense to you, but faces make sense to you. So when you saw that guy that I showed you on the second slide, the actual perpetrator who climbed through the window, you got a brief glimpse of his face in your brain. And again, right now, when you're looking at this face, this region of your brain is active, these colored regions, it's processing this. And the point I want to make that's so essential is that textbook understanding in neuroscience for decades is this: information is stored in the same neural circuits that participate in its initial processing. Information is stored in memory in the same neural circuits. So where's the memory of this guy's face? It's right there in the neural circuits that are processing his face. Now, other aspects of the memory aren't stored in the face processing region. So part of your memory is the house and the window that the guy climbed through, but those are stored elsewhere in your brain. Different parts of the memory are stored in different parts of the brain. And the reason why this is critical to understand is that if the face of this guilty suspect happens to be in the lineup instead of the innocent suspect, so here's the guilty suspect that you saw, if you're seeing his face for the second time, well, it's going to activate these same face processing regions, and it's going to come into contact with the information stored in memory for that face. There's no search process. Face familiarity is not the result of a memory search process. It just happens. The police did the searching and they found the right guy. And when you see this face, this region of the brain is going to process it, and the familiarity signal is going to be right there. Now, other aspects of the memory are not like that. They do require a search, such as if I ask about things that are not physically reproduced at the test, such as what window did this guy climb through in the house? Well, that's different. You got to go search your memory and find that. Recalling other aspects of memory does require a search process. Now, a search process can fail on the first test and succeed on a later test, and perfectly okay. If the witness says, I'm nervous, I can't think straight, I don't know what window he went through. And then, 2 days later, you ask the witness again after they've calmed down, oh yeah, he went through the, second window on the east side of the house or something like that. That's perfectly fine. That's not what I'm talking about. The fact that that can happen, I believe, makes people think that it can happen with face familiarity, that you cannot get a familiarity signal on the first test, can fail to find the familiarity signal, and then successfully find it on a later test. That can't happen. What happened instead, if you see that, it's not that you found the familiarity signal on the second test, it's that the first test put that face there, and that's why it's familiar on a second test. So George Mandler, he was actually the founder of this psychology department at UCSD. I'm looking out the window at a building named after him, has a famous paper in 1980 that speaks to an experience that most of us have had that kind of illustrates this point. Consider seeing a man on a bus whom you're sure that you've seen before. You know him in that sense. Such recognition is usually followed by a search process, asking, in effect, where could I know him from? Who is he? The search process generates likely contexts. Do I know him from work? Is he a movie star, a TV commentator, the milkman? Eventually, the search may end with the insight, that's the butcher from the supermarket. This paper draws a distinction between the familiarity signal that's right then and there and the search process, which may or may not fail. It's two different things. It's important not to conflate them. And I think they are easily conflated and makes our message harder to understand. Now let's revisit the DNA exoneration cases. Remember I told you that any of these outcomes, which is I think the outcomes of the lineup test that I gave you earlier, for the most part, they mean basically this: the suspect does not match my memory of the perpetrator. That's it. You have the information you need. You're contaminating the witness's memory at the same time so that later this witness is going to be making a conclusive misidentification. But what if I told you that on these DNA exoneration cases that convince most people that eyewitness memory is so unreliable? What if I told you that at the beginning they weren't? That is, that at the beginning they said this effectively to the police investigator, and everybody just ignored what they said and listened to the contaminated forensic memory evidence later on. I mean, there's nothing special about memory, right? Any kind of forensic evidence is unreliable when it's contaminated. Memory's not special, it is too. But what about when it's uncontaminated? What if this is what they were saying and nobody listened to them? And I'm saying that is what's happening, I'm going to tell you. So there's multiple lines of evidence that suggest that, but one particular interesting line is from Brandon Garrett in his book, Convicting the Innocent. He obtained court testimony for 161 of the DNA exoneration cases that I was mentioning earlier involving eyewitness misidentification. And as I've said several times, the courtroom IDs were made with high confidence. That pretty much always happens. But it turns out that 92 of those cases had testimony at the trial about the initial identification. The remaining 69 cases didn't. So we don't know what happened in those cases, but we have some information about the majority of cases. And what happened? What did they do on the first test? We know what they did on the last test. In all 92 cases, the testimony indicated that the eyewitness was initially not certain about his or her identification. Instead, it was a hesitant ID or a filler ID or a lineup rejection, which makes perfect sense, right? Because they're looking at somebody who they didn't see commit the crime. Why would they instantly and with high confidence say, that's the guy who did it? No, they're going to do something like this. Now, here's the crazy thing. It came up at trial. And the jury didn't say, oh, that's ridiculous. Why you're changing your mind? It's like the defense attorney says, you didn't identify my client on the first test, and now you're identifying with high confidence. How do you explain that? You'd think the jury would say, okay, this is not credible. No. And if you were a juror, you probably wouldn't either, because it turns out everybody, whatever words come out of the witness's mouth to try to rationalize why this is happening, the witness doesn't know that his or her memory was contaminated. Everybody just believes it. So the witness says, oh, well, I was nervous on the first test, and that's why I didn't recognize the face. But then I calmed down and searched my memory more carefully, and I realized it was him. And everybody just goes, oh, well, okay, then. That explains it. Guilty. And I'm like, no, that doesn't explain it. The witness has no expertise in memory. The witness doesn't know. They're trying to rationalize what happened. Ask an eyewitness memory expert. It's contaminated memory. Assuming a good photo and good faith on the part of the eyewitness, focus on the results of the first test only. No exceptions, no matter what the witness says. Focus on the first test. Now I'm going to tell you about the case that, was a large part of the motivation for writing this paper. And this is not an isolated case. It's an example of many cases like it. On January 29th, 1998, witness Jill Bargner looked through her mini blinds around 6:45 a.m. and saw two men go into her neighbor's house through the garage. They lifted up the garage a little bit and they slid underneath. She thought they might be repairmen or something. After learning later in the day their neighbor had been murdered, she contacted the police and told them that both men were white with shoulder-length hair, thin white guys with shoulder-length hair. The police arrested a thin white male with shoulder-length hair named Richard Lynn Childs, who confessed to being the shooter and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Okay, he's the murderer. My story is not about him, but it's about the accomplice. Who was he? The police suspected a man named Charles Don Flores. He was a known associate of Childs, and they had engaged in a drug deal just hours earlier. Totally, perfectly reasonable for the police to suspect this guy. However, Flores is not a thin white man with long hair, as the witness described. Instead, he's a large Hispanic man with short hair. Here's a composite sketch that the witness made of the accomplice. Looks like a thin white guy with shoulder length hair. Here's a photo of Charles Don Flores at the time. Heavyset Hispanic man with essentially a crew cut. It's a totally different guy. Yet the police put his photo in a lineup anyway and presented it to the witness, which makes no sense at all. This is the face that's in the witness's brain. Whether it's right or wrong, it's not this face. You're not going to find this face in the witness's brain. You're going to put this face in the witness's brain. So here's the lineup that was presented to the witness, and quite reasonably, the witness rejected this lineup. The witness said it's a white dude with shoulder-length hair, not a heavy-set Hispanic dude. About a year later, at trial in 1999, Joe Bargana surprised the defense by showing up and identifying Flores as the accomplice, claiming to be more than 100% positive. The jury convicted Flores and sentenced him to death. He's been on death row for 23 years, all appeals exhausted. Yet on the first and only uncontaminated test, Joe Bargana provided compelling evidence of innocence, not guilt. No juror heard that, no judge ever heard that, nobody heard that. Everybody just saw a very credible witness. The only evidence actually tying him to the crime scene was this, and that's why he was found guilty. And this happens over and over and over again. It happened in most of the DNA exoneration cases that make you think eyewitnesses are unreliable. It's not, I'm saying, it's not really the eyewitnesses who are being unreliable. Test a witness's memory for suspect only once. On the first properly conducted test of uncontaminated memory, eyewitnesses can provide reliable information, including information about innocence. But the first test contaminated memory, so no later test provides more reliable information than the first. It can't. The solution is in principle so simple. Don't test a witness's memory for suspect only once. But I put in principle, like from the ivory tower, everything seems so simple. But the real world, everything's a lot tougher. And what we're going to hear about is maybe a little bit from the Honorable Judge Jed Rakoff, why it's not so simple getting judges to understand something like this. Okay, that is my story. I'll stop sharing.
Great, thanks, John, for that informative and illuminating presentation. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce the Honorable Jed Rakoff, who is U.S. District Judge for the Southern District of New York and frequently sits by designation on the Second and Ninth Circuit Courts of Appeals. He's an adjunct professor at the law schools of both Columbia and NYU, and also teaches at Berkeley Law School and the University of Virginia Law School. Judge Rakoff has served on the National Commission on Forensic Science, and as Dr. Newcomb referenced earlier, served as co-chair of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Eyewitness Identification. He's a regular author of articles, speeches, judicial opinions, and books, including his most recent book, Why the Innocent Plead Guilty and the Guilty Go Free, and Other Paradoxes of Our Broken Legal System, published just last year. So today he'll be providing the judicial perspective on eyewitness identification. So Judge Rakoff, please take it away.
So thank you so much. Notwithstanding that very nice introduction, I am duly intimidated because I don't pretend to have anything like the expertise of Professor Wixted, who spent so many years making so many important contributions to the science of eyewitness identification. And his latest is certainly one of his most important. But I do want to comment on the, if you will, psychology of judges, a weird psychology though it may be. And I think the most important thing to note at the outset is that judges are very adverse to changing their ways. There's a lot of reasons for this. Our system is one of so-called stare decisis, where prior decisions govern future decisions. It's also, I think, somewhat built into the worldview of many judges. But let me give you an example apropos what we've been discussing today. Back in 1923, Learned Hand, who any law professor would tell you is one of, the greatest judges who ever served, wrote this, quote, "Our procedure has always been haunted by the ghost of the innocent man convicted. It is an unreal dream." And that was not only Hand's view in 1923, I think it's fair to say that that was the overwhelming view of the great majority of judges until quite recently. The feeling was we have all these protections for the innocent, the Fifth Amendment, the presumption of innocence, the need for proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and so forth. If anything, the problem will be that some guilty people will be acquitted, not that innocent people will be convicted. But we know better now, that is to say, the general public knows better. Whether judges really know better is a different question. But because most prominently because of the work of the Innocence Project, and as Professor Wixted pointed out, the Innocence Project, which has exonerated hundreds of people using DNA and proven not simply that they were the subject of a technical mistake or something, but that they were actually innocent of the crimes they were accused of, has further refined its analysis to show that the single biggest factor has been inaccurate eyewitness identification. And when you think about this, this is not very surprising. When a judge, or more commonly a jury, sees an eyewitness who typically has no motive to lie, take the stand and say, yeah, that's the guy who done it. That is really powerful evidence. And the jury is completely unaware of the contamination effects that Professor Wixted just referred to. There was an example of this, interestingly enough, in yesterday's New York Times regarding a man named Thomas James, who was found guilty of fatally shooting a man during a robbery, was sentenced to life in prison, and only now, after 31 years in prison, did the Miami State's Attorney's Office determine that he was, quote, actually innocent. And they go on to explain that that's because his conviction rested almost exclusively on the eyewitness testimony of a woman named Catherine Rundle, who said at trial, testified, quote, I'm positive of it. I will never forget his face. I will never forget his eyes, close quote. And how could you not convict with that kind of testimony from an eyewitness? And yet, as she subsequently admitted, though much later, her original identification was much less certain. And in fact, she is now herself convinced that she made a mistake. So Mr. James has now been released, but hey, he spent 31 years in prison. Pretty awful. So the question is, how do we deal with wrongful eyewitness identification? The Supreme Court, which first addressed this kind of issue during the Warren Court years, was mostly focused on police practices, which they could more readily change. And so, for example, as was pointed out by Professor Wixted, an eyewitness, when shown a photo array, is typically told, now the culprit may not even be in there, whereas they used to say, tell us which of the people in the photo array you think is most like the person you saw commit the crime, a much more suggestive approach. But those things are easier to fix than things that are built into the human memory mechanism. And so the question is how to fix it. And I think we're going to spend much of the rest of the hour discussing that. But I would just throw out that I think it's going to be difficult, not impossible, but difficult to get judges to change their view to the point where Professor Wixted would like us to be, where all the jury hears is the initial identification of whether the witness was confident or not confident at that time, as opposed to the inevitably much more confident testimony that the witness gives in court. I'll say one last thing, and that is, if I had one quibble, not just with the article, but with much of the literature in this area, is that its focus very largely on judges and juries. But in fact, our criminal legal system is largely a system controlled by prosecutors. 97% of all people who are accused of felonies plead guilty. Some of them are innocent, about 5 to 10% are innocent. They plead guilty because of the high penalties they potentially face. But the point is that, in my view, the people we most have to educate about the contamination of eyewitness identification are the prosecutors, because they are the ones who will often be making the really operative decisions. So let me pause at that point and open the floor to any questions.
Great, thanks very much for those comments, Judge Rakoff. So at this point in the program, we invite John to jump back on screen so our two panelists can discuss and reflect on what we've heard so far. So John, if you'd like to go ahead.
Okay, thanks. That was a really interesting comment that you just concluded with. And it almost made me excited, because you said, basically, we're not going to change judges' minds very easily, but might it be possible to change prosecutors' minds a little more easily when they're making plea bargains, that when they're trying to decide if there's evidence of guilt or innocence in this case, that they should be looking at the first test only, because assuming, for the prosecutors, which I think is the large majority of them who are trying to serve the cause of justice, if that's what they're trying to do, maybe it'd be easier to convince them. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
I absolutely agree. I think, frankly, it's a lot easier because virtually all prosecutors in state and federal offices go through a training early on when they become prosecutors. And in my experience up to now, that training has not included anything about the science of eyewitness identification, but there's no reason why it couldn't. None of this is so difficult to understand. You don't have to be a scientist to understand what you just explained so eloquently, which is how the brain, unconsciously, if you will, changes memories, contaminates memories, and the more the eyewitness is asked to identify, the more he or she is convinced is the person that he or she is now picturing in his brain. And many, many times, prosecutors will be told by the police identifying a case, well, there were 2 suspects or 3 suspects, and there was some circumstantial evidence about X and some about Y and some about Z, but in the end, we're convinced it's C because we've got an eyewitness. And if the prosecutors were more skeptical of that, then they might well say to the police, well, let's take a moment and have you go back and further look at X and Y before we indict Z, because there's other evidence here, and eyewitness identification is not always so terrific. And the prosecutor might ask us, what was the level of confidence in the initial photo array presentation? Along those lines, one thing that the National Academy of Science report that I was privileged to co-chair recommended was that all of this be videotaped and subject to recording. So you would see both what the eyewitness was initially shown and also what the eyewitness then said. which very often is, gee, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that sounds like it would upgrade the situation a lot. And recording confidence, I mean, Gary Wells has been recommending that, I think, since 1998. That's been a consistent recommendation. It's an important piece of information. Another one that might be added is record latency. Latency is so informative because, as I said, the face familiarity signal is, it's not a search process. You really know in seconds, not minutes, if any face is matching the witness's memory of the perpetrator. Yet you see, when I do watch those videotapes, occasionally they make them, a witness will sit there 10, 15 minutes, thinking about trying to figure out which guy it is, and will sometimes land on the suspect. And as I said, the police will write down, witness positively identify the suspect, and all that. If it's videotaped, you see that actually that was an extremely hesitant ID, and the words positively identified don't really convey that flavor. So now, yeah, it's probably the case. I mean, a lot of the questions that came in advance and has always been on my mind is, how do we educate judges? But I guess like 95% of the battle is prosecutors and police recording what happened actually. And those two things together is probably 95% of the battle, when it felt like it's judges who are making all those calls.
Yeah, another reason I think that is important to focus is that I'm skeptical that judges will ever adopt, absent legislation, the proposal that you talk about in your article of eliminating in-court identifications, even though, as you so well pointed out, they are not only inaccurate, but they're powerful, and very little a defense counsel can do, even with the best cross-examination. But the reason I think judges will be reluctant to eliminate that is, first and foremost, it fits with the rules of evidence. So the federal rules of evidence say that anything that is relevant and anything that is likely to be make a fact of importance in the case more likely than not should be admissible. The whole push of the federal rules, but also most state rules as well, is when in doubt, let it in. And so it would take a lot. And when evidence is excluded, it's often not because of generalizations made on general scientific principles, but rather of something very specific to the particular case, where you can say, oh yes, the policeman, when you said it was, gee, I wonder if it's number 2, and he patted you on the back and said, good work. That's the kind of thing that would lead to eyewitness identification being excluded before trial, but not a more general principle of the kind that you're talking about. I don't think it could be easily accomplished. Now, there are mechanisms for educating judges. Both state and federal judges have regular educational programs that often do include recent scientific advances. My experience is that that has a momentary impact, but not a long-term impact. I guess that's an empirically testable hypothesis, but that's my experience.
I was wondering, I have watched judges scoff at the idea of eliminating in-court identification. So what you're saying is not surprising to me. I did wonder if there might be a sort of compromise solution, which is that I think, and I could be wrong, that for other kinds of forensic evidence, like for fingerprint examiners, usually, I think, could be wrong here, that they testify when they're, for the prosecution anyway, when they're confident of the match. I don't know if that's true or not, but I did wonder for eyewitnesses, what would also address the problem is, yeah, we let eyewitnesses make the identification in court if they made a conclusive identification on the first test, maybe something like that. I don't know.
Well, that's
might
an
be-
interesting thought. It would require, again, I think, a change in the rules because expert testimony is subject to special rules that require greater judicial oversight. But this is not expert testimony. This is viewed as just lay testimony. I remember seeing the guy, and there he is. And so none of those special rules come into play under the current rules of evidence. One experiment that's been done in New Jersey is to have the court tell the jury, either at the time of the identification or more commonly at the close of all the evidence as part of its general instructions. Now, there are many issues concerning eyewitness identification, and you have to give this particular care and scrutiny because of the many complications affecting eyewitness identification. And at least one state, the Supreme Court of New Jersey, adopted an approach like that and has model instructions. I think that another alternative is to have experts testify for the defense. In many states, that would require public funds because the defendant can't afford it. But when it's coming from the judge, of course, it has a more powerful message.
Yeah, it does seem like that's yet another potentially workable angle rather than changing what judges do, but jury instructions that maybe would somehow reflect what scientists have come to believe is true. Any jury instructions that could help the witnesses keep the focus on the first ID would certainly be beneficial. So yeah, you've come up with a lot that I hadn't realized, different from what I thought my focus was going to be with you today, is how do we convince judges, but actually it's police practices, prosecutors, and maybe jury instructions those are better ways to think about how to improve things. So yeah.
Well, you know, there are two types of people in this world. There are timid people who are inherently careful and unsure of their opinions. And there are people who are totally cocksure and absolutely certain they are right. And we call that latter category judges.
Yeah, and that latter category, judges have the luxury of being that way. Nobody else does. That might help to explain why it's that way. So, okay, well, that's all very interesting. Oh, here's Amy to probably tell us there are some questions from listeners.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions here, so I was hoping we could pose some of those to you both. I think this is something you've somewhat touched on already, but are there active efforts right now or efforts being planned to change how eyewitness identification is used and implemented in the justice system? Like, is this something that's underway or any kind of movement? And is there anything that psychological science can do to support that?
Well, the first thing to remember is that most of the criminal justice system is state prosecutions and state law. Federal prosecutions are about 10% or less of the total figures. And of course, with 50 states, you have 50 different views. Yes, there have been states where there's been attention being given to this, and other states where it's not only ignored, but viewed as, they're just trying to get those guilty guys off. That's a challenge. I will say this, since the Supreme Court first began looking at police practices in this area, which was way back during the Warren Court years, there have been significant improvements by police forces throughout much of the United States in how they handle lineups and photo arrays and what they tell the person who's being asked to make the identifications for. Not perfect, not consistent among all 50 states, but definitely improvements. So I think in that sense, I'm an optimist. I think that after all, you know, a policeman or a prosecutor wants to get the right guy. So I think that is where I would put a lot of the attention.
Yeah, and I'll just add that there has been, you know, very concerted efforts by the Innocence Project and Gary Wells and others to travel to different states to get them to change their eyewitness identification procedures. As Judge Rakoff just mentioned, some state legislatures have actually mandated changes to eyewitness identification procedures in accordance with recommendations. So yeah, it is underway, but it has been for a while, has a long way to go.
Great, thanks. So I think this question is for Dr. Wixted. So earlier you qualified your recommendations about eyewitness identification saying assuming a good photo, but we can't always necessarily assume that the photo will be like current or you know, the suspect might look different than they do in a previous photo. So how would that kind of, how does that come into play? How potentially a person looks now might be different from their photo?
Yeah, we discussed that very issue in our paper, and that's clearly going to be a contested issue. The point we make is that I use the recognizable photo. If his friends would recognize it as him, then it means that the combination, the unique combination of facial features that separate him from everybody else in the world are in that photo, even though it's not a great photo. And our argument would be that if it's recognizably him, even though not a great photo, that is going to make a good photo more familiar than it otherwise would have been. So that contaminates memory. But if it's not even recognizable to people who know him, then it cannot possibly contaminate memory. It's perfectly fine. And I can imagine that that will be contested at times. And, you know, like a jury will be asked to decide, you know, is this photo good enough or not, or something like that. But yeah, that's the principle. It will, if it's not recognizable, it can't contaminate memory. If it is, it can't help but contaminate memory. And there'll be times when I don't know, some judge or jury will be called upon to decide how good a photo that was.
Great, thanks. So I think this question is for both of you from the scientific and the legal side. What are your thoughts regarding cases where witnesses locate the suspect themselves? They decide to play investigator and go out looking for them and identify them, or even just organically running into them in the world. Should their subsequent identifications of those suspects be considered reliable? And are they in court?
Well, go ahead, Judge.
No, I was just going, the answer to the second question is yes, they are considered reliable in court as subject to cross-examination, of course. In those cases, the motivation of the eyewitness will be explored more by the defense counsel than they would in an ordinary case. But still, if you want to know what the current law is, the current law is that is admissible evidence.
Yeah, and one of the recommendations in the Wells et al. 2020 white paper is, you know, in an interview, warn witnesses not to do that. Don't go searching for the face on, you know, social media. Don't go looking for them out there in the real world because from I don't know, a memory science perspective, that's a bad way to test an eyewitness's memory. First of all, right, in a lineup, like the police have reason to believe it might be this guy, and they put his photo in. If this is just searching social media or driving around town and looking at tons and tons of faces, and they're going to come across somebody who resembles that perpetrator, even if he's innocent. There's no reason to believe it might be him. It's just it's a way to find a doppelganger, so to speak, and it's bad. So yeah, legally, I guess the court, as the judge pointed out, they can still use that, but the testimony from, I think, any memory expert would be that is not a trustworthy identification. That's how to test eyewitness memory in a way that gets at the truth of the matter. Sure.
Okay, for Judge Rakoff, how confident are you that eyewitness evidence, or really any evidence more broadly, is being appropriately scrutinized at the plea phase that, like you had touched on earlier, considering most prosecutors are under no legal obligation to share relevant discovery? And presuming there is not sufficient scrutiny of evidence at the plea phase, what can research psychologists do about that? Is there anything they can do?
So when there's a guilty plea, a judge makes a very limited inquiry. And the argument that's sometimes made, oh, well, because the person has to allocute to the crime, the judge will find out if there are any problems, is complete baloney. The average allocution of a guilty plea in the United States is 13 minutes. And of that, 9 minutes are spent telling the defendant all the constitutional rights he's giving up if he pleads guilty and getting his assent to that. And so a very, very small portion of the allocution is about what actually happened. Moreover, the judge, even a judge who wants to find out more, is in a poor position to do so for the reason that the question kind of alluded to. The judge knows nothing about the case. He's seeing the case either for the first time or at most the second time, the first time when the guy was arrested and arraigned. So he doesn't have a basis to make a really nuanced inquiry about the facts of the case that he might have been able to do if he had lived with the case the way a prosecutor or a police person has. So the allocution is of no help to this particular problem.
Great, thanks. I think that's about all we have time for today for our program. So I'd again like to thank Dr. John Wixted and Judge Jed Rakoff for putting on an amazing event and sharing their views on the science, law, and policy of eyewitness identification. I'd also like to give a shout out to my APS colleagues who did so much work to make this event happen, particularly Andy DeSoto and Emily Proppy. Finally, I invite you to attend the next PSPI Live, which will focus on the subject of chronic pain. So please stay tuned for more details to come on that. Thank you all again and have a great day.